Stanley Milgram's electric shock experiment has a lesson for the church. Let me just say that again. Stanley Milgram's electric shock experiment has a lesson for the church. You may or may not have heard of Stanley Milgram's electric shock experiment before, or perhaps you have heard of it referenced somewhere sometime, but may not be familiar with its name or any real level of detail how the experiment worked. So before we move any further, we need to get grounded on the basic components of the experiment. The following explanation of the experiment is from the online resource, Simply Psychology. What was the objective of the experiment? Stanley Milgram in 1963 was interested in researching how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. Stanley Milgram was interested in how easily ordinary people could be influenced into committing atrocities. For example, German leaders, soldiers, and citizens during World War II. Let's look briefly at the procedure of the experiment. Volunteers were recruited for a controlled experiment investigating so-called learning environments. Participants were 40 males, aged between 20 and 50, whose jobs ranged from unskilled to professional from the New Haven, Connecticut area. They were paid $4.50 for just turning up. That's equivalent to about $45 today. At the beginning of the experiment, they were introduced to another participant who was, unbeknownst to them, a part of the team conducting the experiment. They drew straws to determine their roles, learner or teacher, although this was rigged and the other so-called participant was always the learner. The paid volunteer, the only one not in on how the experiment was actually being conducted, always became the teacher when they drew straws. There was also an experimenter dressed in a gray lab coat played by an actor. 2 rooms in the Yale University Interaction Laboratory were used, one for the learner, with a chair connected to an electricity circuit, and another for the teacher and experimenter with an electric shock generator. The learner, who was always referred to as Mr. Wallace, was strapped in one room to a chair with electrodes. After he has learned a list of word pairs given to him, the teacher tests him by naming a word and asking the learner to recall its partner or pair from the list of 4 possible choices. The teacher and experimenter in another room where they could hear the learner but not see him. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner makes a mistake, that is, every time he doesn't give the correct answer, increasing the level of shock each time. There were 30 switches on the shock generator marked from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, to 450 volts, labeled danger, severe shock. The learner gave mainly wrong answers, on purpose since he was a part of the experiment. And for each of these, the teacher gave him an electric shock. When the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter in the gray formal lab coat was to give a series of orders or prods to ensure they continued. There were 4 prods, and if one was not obeyed, then the experimenter, Mr. Williams, escalated to the next prod, and so on. Prod 1 was, please continue. Prod 2 was, the experiment requires you to continue. Prod 3 was, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And Prod 4 was, you have no other choice but to continue. The result is that 65%, right at 2/3 of the participants, that is, the teachers administering the shock and the only one not in on the experiment, 2/3 of them continued to the highest level of 450 volts, and all the participants continued to at least 300 volts. The conclusion was that the individual explanation for the behavior of the participants would be that it was something about them as people that caused them to obey. But a more realistic explanation is that the situation they were in influenced them and caused them to behave in the way that they did. Some of the aspects of the situation that are considered to have influenced their behavior included the formality of the location, the authoritative behavior of the experimenter in the gray lab coat, and the fact that it was an experiment for which they had volunteered and had been paid. Ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, sometimes even to the extent of harming or killing another innocent human being. Obedience to authority is ingrained in us all from the way we are brought up. People tend to obey orders from other people if they recognize their authority as morally right and/or legally based. This response to legitimate authority is learned in a variety of situations, for example, in the family, in the school, or in the workplace. One thing the explanation above could make clear is that there were never any electric shocks actually administered. The learner, as we've called him in this explanation, was a part of the experiment, an actor, and pretended to get shocked and had pre-planned reactions he would act out for each level of voltage, including begging for the experiment to stop at predetermined voltages. The tester, however, the only person involved that didn't know that actual electric shocks weren't being administered, was never informed that they weren't actually shocking the person in the other room, that they could hear but not see. There are a number of social and moral issues that this test is intended to help address, particularly in light of such atrocities as the Jewish Holocaust or other dark moments in human history. But I started to consider some implications that these sociological and psychological tendencies might have in the church. Our tendency to obey people in apparent authority, to be compliant in formal situations, or fall in line if something has been considered standardized or legislated, all have implications for conduct within the church. However, there is another finding from this study that has been shared in other forms that is of most interest for this discussion. That other finding says that once a person is involved or invested to a certain point, the willingness to stop, or to even question whether what is happening is acceptable, or decide to go in another direction, becomes nearly impossible for many people. The technical term for this is plan continuation bias, a strong bias to just keep doing what we are already doing once it's set in motion. And getting people to this point is rather predictable. You start by getting them involved in something that sounds worthwhile, and then slowly migrate over time, either intentionally or not, to actions that, if it was the first thing you asked them to do, they would not have even considered doing it. But now that they've gone down the path with you a ways, feeling good or justified in the first few steps, it becomes very awkward and uncomfortable to say you are going to abandon what has been started, even though the current actions don't seem quite right. Plan continuation bias in action. I have come to understand that this tendency, while perhaps not as dramatic as some of the other findings from Milgram's study, can have serious implications within the church. And when coupled with the tendency of people to comply in formal situations or to acquiesce to those who have some level of authority, can cause an entire organization to become misguided or distracted from the very purpose of the organization to exist in the first place. This has serious implications for the church. History shows us a number of examples of this within the church, It almost always took a courageous person like Martin Luther or John Wesley or others to be willing to take great personal risk to call out some needed change within the church. Others may have seen the need, but the formality of the church rituals made it nearly impossible to even bring up the topic. The established authority within the church doesn't react well to change most of the time. Bible verses about unity and not causing the division in the church are used against anyone that dares to suggest that some things need to improve. How dare you suggest that we need to fix some things? How dare you stir up that kind of trouble in the church? Let's not forget that the Jewish religion was well established, had great tradition, formality and regulation, and well-recognized leaders. There was a clearly established line of authority that was to be respected and followed. So when Jesus came along and said that there were some serious adjustments that needed to happen, it didn't go over very well. As a matter of fact, it went over so poorly that the authorities, with the help of many of the congregants, murdered him. They lied about him, made false allegations, and used the Roman government to have him arrested, beaten, and crucified on a cross. Don't mess with our plan. Plan continuation bias. But let's see, does any of that apply today? A long history of tradition and custom that people are used to, a formal authority structure, a well-established protocol as to how things are supposed to occur when people assemble, with pre-established roles and procedures, limited opportunities and space for people to actually question or challenge. Well, I think if we're honest with ourselves, that pretty much describes the vast majority of churches in America today. The reality is that most of our churches have set up the perfect scenario to fall victim to plan continuation bias. We do what we do. We defend what we do. We declare that it can't possibly be wrong because we've been doing it for a long time. We don't take kindly to those that suggest we may be off target. We run to the formal leadership to ensure they squelch any naysayers before they can gain any traction. Let's squelch this before it becomes a problem. Plan continuation bias, alive and breathing well within the church. But does this really matter? A few facts. Church affiliation has been in a steady decline in America for over 60 continuous years. A steady decline in church affiliation for 6 decades straight. More than 75% of kids raised in the church leave the church within a year of graduating high school, and very few ever come back. Recent nationwide surveys show that fewer people in America believe in God than any other time in our nation's history. So yeah, it matters. When all the data suggests that what we are doing isn't working, let's just keep doing the same things, the same way we've always done them. After all, we've invested a lot of time and money. So let's just keep doing the same things in the same way and cross our fingers that something magically happens to turn around all these downward trends that have been occurring for decades. Plan continuation bias. Let's admit it. We're deep in the middle of it. You know yourself. You know your church. You know if you or your church is burdened with this plan continuation bias. I think our natural tendency is to say that, oh, that's the church down the road. Let me just close by suggesting that we stop pointing to the church down the road and instead take a good, hard look in the mirror. If we do, we just might find that Stanley Milgram's electric shock experiment has a lesson for us. And that lesson is that we just might be our own biggest obstacle because we are deep in the middle of plan continuation bias within our churches. And we just aren't ready or willing to admit it. Thank you for listening. God bless you.